Now, the second thing I want to do is to take a historical example that sort of illustrates the weaknesses of a reliance on diplomacy, on multi-state institutions, etc. When there is an aggressor who is not interested in coexistence, peaceful coexistence, but is interested in domination. And I'm going to use the remarkable rise of Philip II of Macedon in the 4th century BC. I mean, everybody knows about Alexander. We call him the Great, which is probably not a good thing to do. Remember, Alexander killed more Greeks than the Persians ever did. Everybody knows about Alexander, but Alexander is not possible without his father, Philip II. And Philip II is really a remarkable figure. In 359, when he becomes king of Macedon, Macedon is the other powerful Greek states. Macedon is the semi-barbarian, if not barbarian, backwater that they're used to pushing around. And within 21 years, Philip has destroyed the freedom of all the Greek city-states. Something that the Persians were not able to do, something that 27 years of war between Athens and Sparta didn't end up doing, but he ended up doing it, and it didn't come back for centuries and centuries. In fact, I would say 1821, when Greece finally gets its independence from the Ottomans. Now, how did Philip do this? Certainly he did it through military means. The army that Alexander takes to Persia is created by his father Philip. It's a beautifully trained, disciplined army of about 30,000. It's a professional army, not a citizen militia, as in most of the other city-states. He develops innovations in phalanx fighting. He lengthens the spear. He integrates the cavalry into the infantry in new ways. So very definitely, military power was a key factor. But he wasn't known in antiquity as a brilliant general or a brilliant military man, but as a brilliant negotiator and diplomatist. And it was his exploitation of those processes that really account for his success. And so that example can show us some of the weaknesses of the idea that interstate relations can be managed on the basis of diplomacy, transnational institutions. For us, these would be things, of course, like the UN or NATO or the International Court of Justice, etc. All of these kinds of institutions that we think can substitute for power, force. One obvious problem is that if states are motivated by their interests rather than by commitment to lofty ideals, they can be exploited by an aggressor who will promise one state some level of help in its dealings with other states. And this is what Philip did masterfully. And indeed, in antiquity, ancient historians, when they talked about, well, what was the problem with the Greek states that allowed Philip to succeed? It said they were all pursuing their own individual interests in trying to use Philip to help them. And he was very eager to step in and help them, right? Because that was how he expanded his power. There's a couple of quotes. One from Demosthenes, of course, the great Athenian orator who saw the threat of Philip and tried to rouse the Athenians to a response, which they finally did at the Battle of Chaeronea. By then it was too late. And Demosthenes wrote of Philip, "He has hoodwinked everyone that has had any dealings with him. He has played upon the folly of each party in turn and exploited their ignorance of his own character." And this was because every community imagined that they were to be the recipients of his favors. So rather than seeing his long-term designs on all of Greece, that he was an aggressor, they thought, no, I can use this guy and his influence so I can achieve my aims. Never forget, the Greek city-states, they're each sort of like little nations. There's no Greece. There's no country of Greece. Now, they have a conception of Hellenes that they contrast with barbarians, Persians, etc. But for an Athenian, Athenian freedom is about Athenian freedom. It's not about some universal freedom for all the Greeks. So they pursued their parochial interest at each other's expense. And rather than recognizing the aggressor who would end all of their freedoms, tried to use him to achieve their own aims. The 1st century BC historian Pompeius Trogus talks about this. And he's, by the way, we don't have his work so much as a later Roman, a sort of summary of it by a historian named Justin. And he writes, the states of Greece, while each sought to gain the sovereignty of the country for itself, lost it as a body. Striving intemperately to ruin one another, they did not perceive till they were oppressed by another power that what each lost was a common loss to all. For Philip, king of Macedonia, looking as from a watchtower for an opportunity to attack their liberties and fomenting their contentions by assisting the weaker, obliged victors and vanquished alike to submit to his royal yoke. So Philip saw this and he knew it and he could exploit it. We could say, sure, I'll take your side. Okay? So that's the first problem. As states pursue their interests, that will bind them to the larger threat of an aggressor. And they might even invite him in for a short-term gain, which ultimately ends up into, of course, a long-term disaster. A second problem, and one endemic to democracies, republics, any state whose business is conducted through language, words, persuasion, and processes such as that, and that is too often talk becomes a substitute for action. Diplomatic conversation or the democratic process itself of discussion and debate, which is, by the way, why we have political freedom, of course. Nonetheless, these can be dangerous because the process itself can give cover for simply not taking the action that needs to be taken because you just don't want to, because it's too difficult, it's too expensive, or whatever. And throughout this period, particularly in the speeches of Demosthenes, we see him hammering this point home over and over again. We have to stop talking, we have to start doing something. So we hear Demosthenes chastising the Athenians, as in the first Philippic, one of his speeches against Philip, in which he says, we are forever debating the same question and never making any progress. He says, we pass empty decrees and indulge the hopes of the speaker's platform. All words, he writes, apart from action, seem vain and idle, especially words from Athenian lips, for the greater our reputation for a ready tongue, the greater the distrust it inspires in all men. That we talk and talk and talk, and we never do anything. And so all of our potential allies say, why should we pay any attention to them, align ourselves with them? They're not going to actually do anything. They're just going to talk about doing something. I hope we can see the long and fruitless negotiations that have been going on with North Korea for the last 20 or some years reflected in this. And I would say the fruitless negotiations that we're going to start engaging in with Iran to see the same sort of idea. He says something in another speech that's very interesting. He says, Demosthenes, where either side devotes its time and energy, there it exceeds the better. Philip in action, praxis, but you in argument. Or he says, logoi. He says, you guys are great at speeches and you're great at argument, but this isn't the time for speeches and argument. This is the time for action.